Okay, this is the audio review for the final exam, SOC 351. Okay, so the first one here is just all of these social constructions that we have about parenting, right? So the first is this assumption of a maternal instinct, which assumes that women are, somehow naturally, biologically suited to just care for children, right? Obviously, that's a social construction, that's a myth. It's not some sort of biological drive in just that way. There's also a lot of ways that's socially constructed, right? What we consider appropriate has everything to do with the culture and the value systems of that culture. Same thing with compulsory motherhood. This idea that, we assume that all women want to get married, want to have kids in that order. And so, since some women are not having kids at all, some women are, not getting married at all, right? But having kids or, any of those kind of things. So that we're changing the definitions of what's normative in the culture. So, this relationship that we've had for many years between getting married and having kids is really breaking down, right? Because of those changes, because some women are just not having kids and some women are having kids but not getting married, right? So that connection, that compulsory motherhood is breaking down. When it comes to the parenting styles, just that, we talked about some of the different social constructions or how society affects these things, like social class, right? How obviously your parenting style is going to have to do with what kind of financial resources and what time you have to devote to your kids. So social class has a big bearing on that. Demographic patterns. Okay, so reasons for low fertility. Well, our economy is different now, right? So women have to be in the workforce like we expect a dual earning couple. So as a result, families need that much money. So a lot of women work. People also are getting married later. So that means there's going to be less children if they're getting married later into their childbearing years. And there's just a higher divorce rate in general. So if there's more time periods of marital disillusion, trying to find new partners, things like that, that's just time periods you're not having kids. All right, delayed childbearing. So there's two factors we talked about delaying childbearing are just the increased age at first marriage, right? If we've gone up from a norm of, right outside of your teens to basically your low to mid 20s, then just that change affects how many people, are having kids. And also the fact that nowadays you need to get to such a high level of education before you can get a substantive career. So a lot of people get their bachelor's, their master's, sometimes even PhDs or MDs before they actually settle down. So that's a little bit different too. Like people have a career first, then kids, instead of kids and then a career. So those are the two factors basically. It's just how old they are when they first get married and, trying to have a career. When it comes to unmarried parenting in teens, teens account for about a quarter of all unmarried children that are born in a year. Okay, sandwich generation. So that's just a group of people that have to take care of their adult children and their aging parents. When it comes to same-sex parents, that there's research that's shown that children that are raised by same-sex parents have pretty much all the same outcomes, except for that they tend to experience discrimination from others, right? Because of their parents. But otherwise, they develop normally in regards to all their expectations about stuff and understandings. Let's see, benefits of parenthood. So the first is symbolic mortality, or sorry, immortality, sorry, that you live on through your kids, right? It gives an enhanced status in the culture. Also, some people find that having kids gives them a sense of meaning or purpose. And kids can be a positive impact on a marital relationship. Let's see, what else? Oh, cost of parenthood. Well, some kids aren't super great. No, I'm just kidding. But basically, some kids cause a lot of tension or problems. Maybe they have negative personality traits and, or just even worrying about them. The kind of worry that a lot of parents have can affect, their own relationships and their own marital bond, right? Let's see, birth order. So we were talking about some of the different aspects of, the differences in ideology among firstborns. So firstborns, because they're kind of more concentratedly socialized, they tend to kind of mirror more what their parents' value system is. Um, so for female firstborns, they tend to be more religious and more sexually conservative. So they'll be more accepting of traditional gender roles than, other young women, born later on in that birth order. Let's see, social class and life chances. I mean, isn't that it right there? Right? Obviously, that your social class is a crucial factor in what kind of opportunities you have in life, right? What kind of education you get, what kind of, healthcare you have, what kind of job opportunities you end up with, what kind of neighborhood you live in, all that fun stuff. Let's see, supports for working parents. So flex time is just a kind of variable work schedule that's common in other countries that is often, helpful to dual earner families where, you basically can change your schedule, but you can also take periods of time off to deal with, either childbirth or, maybe family illness or things like that. All right, moving on to chapter 11. So, compared to other countries in the world, the US has, very high rates of violence. And part of this issue is living in a violent society, meaning living in a culture that normalizes violence and kind of promotes it institutionally affects the kind of violence we see in the culture. So even the system of the family, the hierarchy of it, and the patriarchal model, right, of father above mother, above children, creates an asymmetry which opens the door ultimately to violence, right? So when it comes to specifically the murder and rape rates in the U.S., they are 4 times higher than any other advanced nation. Let's see. U.S. violence rates in comparative perspective. So that just means that, the economic inequality that people face already in society, if you combine that with racial or ethnic discrimination, that's going to lead to more issues of violent crime as well. Violence in the media, basically just that we love violence, right? We glorify it. It's our entertainment, right? So we don't really take violence in the culture as seriously as we need to, largely because it's so normal to us. Let's see, social organization of the family, just the structure of the family in a patriarchal model, right? Like I just discussed. So, when we have a system that promotes male dominance, but either religiously or, the structure of the legal system historically, that power is then not equally distributed, right? There's a decision maker and there's people that have to follow those decisions. It's not a democracy, right? So that often promotes violence in the way that not everyone has an equal say in what happens, so that causes power asymmetries. And, if someone challenges someone in a higher status position, that can then open the door for violence. Let's see here. Okay, so when talking about social class and IPV, obviously, the stress and strain of poverty can lead to issues of violence, and that is also related to IPV. Alcohol abuse, also related to IPV, in the fact that when people abuse alcohol or other drugs, they often lose control, and this can kind of, it's very highly correlated with issues of violence. Family history of abuse is another one, meaning that adults who experience violence as kids are more likely to perpetuate it in their own family when they're adults, though obviously it's not like predictive. It's just a matter of, people not necessarily unlearning those kind of, in a basic social learning theory aspect, not unlearning the negative behaviors. Intimate terrorism, just your kind of definition from the book, that it's a type of violence that tends to escalate over time. And it's really a relationship that's kind of founded on power and control, right? It's clearly gendered, but it tends to be men controlling and isolating women in order to kind of manipulate them, and then, escalation of violence over time as this person becomes more controlled and more isolated. So why does she stay? Well, there's a lot of reasons why women stay in these situations. Most people don't realize that violence tends to escalate when people leave. But, women don't stay because they want to be hurt. That idea of like, oh, they just like being a victim. That's not why, right? It's fear. It's fear of leaving and having retaliation or what happens to your kids. It's, hope and love. It's just wishing that this person would change, right? It's self-blame. It's the fact that people just say, well, it's my fault that I'm here and I deserve to be here. And it's the economic dependency that if you don't have enough money to leave and this person is very good at manipulating you and controlling you and making sure you don't have access to money outside of them, then what can you really do, right? When it comes to domestic violence and same-sex relationships, so we talked a little bit about how in some states there's like a mandatory arrest situation in situations of domestic violence, but police are often not specifically trained in how to deal with same-sex communities, because if you assume by gender that the male is the perpetrator, what happens when both people are male or both people are female, right? That it becomes almost this invisible problem, especially because with less resources available to these communities, there's less likelihood of people kind of coming out and talking about it. And we talked a little bit about how the communities tend to be somewhat insular as well, meaning it's already difficult to find people that kind of, accept you and understand you, like a small queer community. And especially in a lot of places, if you're experiencing violence within that community, you might not come forward just because you're afraid of losing the community. 4 types of child abuse and neglect. So you have physical, emotional, sexual, and neglect. Neglect is right there in the name. Let's see, social class also related to child abuse, right? What's interesting is that higher socioeconomic statuses, right? People that are rich, those cases of abuse tend to go unreported more so than in poor communities. That's why we tend to see a lot more children entering the criminal justice system, or their parents entering the criminal justice system as a result of abuse when they're poor. But obviously social class affects who goes to jail, who has a lawyer, who's able to circumvent these things. Since they have more power and status, they're able to kind of hide and coach these things more. Sibling abuse is extremely common, right? The most common form of abuse, but we don't even talk about it as an issue of abuse. When it comes to elder abuse, 5 out of every 6 cases of elder abuse go unreported. So it's extremely underreported. And part of this has to do with ageism, right? Which is the fact that we devalue the elderly in the culture. So we don't see them as worthy. We think that they're declining, right? We see them as less valuable. And we often negatively stereotype them or discriminate against them. All right, moving on to chapter 12. Okay, so let's see here. Age at first marriage. So basically the younger you are when you get married for the first time, the more likely you are to divorce. Income is another factor correlated with divorce, right? Meaning if there's big differentials in who's earning what, if women tend to earn more than men, as you saw in the one of the other articles you read during the section, that can be correlated with divorce. Religion is another factor correlated with divorce, so meaning people that are married that have 2 different religious ideologies are more likely to get divorced than people with the same religious ideology. Intergenerational transmission of divorce, there's just the likelihood that if you grew up in a family that experienced divorce, you're more likely to yourself divorce. All right, so the his divorce, her divorce just means his divorce is the fact that men tend to gain standard of living, have increased freedom, but also experience personal isolation. While for women, her divorce is characterized by personal isolation and also a decreased standard in living. So not great. So when it comes to children and divorce, family size is an impact there, meaning, family size impacts how likely a divorce is. Also, when it comes to remarriage after divorce, about half of all marriages in any day are actually a remarriage for at least one person in that relationship. So the probability of remarriage itself is affected by all sorts of social factors, right? We talked about, age affects this, social class, your race or ethnicity, and then, of course, religion. So we talked about a bunch of different types of step families. You got stepmother families, stepfather families, you got complex step families, right? The difference being, stepfather families are the ones where, the new person coming into the family is the stepfather versus the stepmother's, when she's the person kind of coming into a family arrangement. And stepmother families tend to have more difficult time integrating children than stepfather families do. And there's also complex step families, right, where it's kind of like the Brady Bunch, like his and hers, right? They marry as a remarriage, but they both have children living with them. And then when it comes to remarriage among the elderly, about 500,000 people over the age of 65 remarry every year. So that's pretty intense, about 500,000 people a year. So that's a lot of people over 65 that are still getting married again. All right, and then moving on to the articles from the Family Issue Reader. Okay, so for the first one, I'm not going to lose my kids to the street. Basically, that's kind of the answer right there, right? That parenting as a Hispanic woman affected the way that they mothered, right? So their culture or their identity influenced the way that they mothered, their connection to the Spanish language, to kind of cultural values, things like that. For the article Abused Husbands, a Narrative, basically I want you to look there at the 4 ways that husbands dealt with the abuse, right? So specifically, we could go into all the depth of each one, but I mean, avoidance, right? Just trying to actually kind of keep yourself away from the issue. Placation, just trying to keep this person happy in order to hopefully avoid a violent outburst. Disassociation, which is very common in issues of abuse, where you just kind of almost lose touch with reality, just kind of almost daydream to leave the situation mentally so that you can kind of survive in the day-to-day term. Or physical response, right, was the 4th way. Let's see, physical health effects of intimate partner abuse. So risk groups, those are just people that experience a higher risk of any sort of negative outcome. So if you're talking about IPA or intimate partner abuse, then risk groups are just people that are more likely to be abused, right? Or to face violence. So in this situation, what they do is they determine risk groups so that they can target them for interventions, right? So if you say that, okay, there's this particular group, they're more likely to end up facing violence, then you can kind of preventatively target that overall group and hopefully give them resources and prevent them from experiencing violence, right? So that's kind of the connection to gender. When they focus resources and prevention at women, that doesn't mean that men aren't abused. It just means that since women are more likely to be abused, that they target the intervention there, right? So that they do that so that, and the kind of example that they gave in the reading was that, if we target our intervention on breast cancer on women, then a lot of women are helped by that, but that doesn't mean that if a man gets breast cancer, he won't get help, right? It just means that a lot of the targeting and branding and the kind of advertising of the culture is, much more on women because they are more likely to get breast cancer, right? Does it make sense? So it's that same kind of effect there when it comes to intimate partner abuse, right? Men are abused by their partners, but because of the likelihoods and the kind of asymmetrical power or asymmetrical gender relations there, then, a lot of the targeting happens towards women as a risk group. All right, wives, economic resources, and risk of divorce. So that's, again, I'm just giving you the answers here. That's what that is. Basically that, what I'm just looking there for like what factors they talked about in the conclusion that were related to risk of divorce, right? So income and destabilization, right? That as the income expanded, so did the destabilization. That labor market participation actually helped, right? That it tended to stabilize relationships, right? And then when it came to some of the economic issues or resources and the risk of getting divorced, there was a significant difference between the respondents that were white and those that were black in what was actually the outcome. So that's all I want you to know for those. And then for the last one there, so highly educated women and hypergamy, right? Oh, what a depressing point. Why leave it on that point? But anyway, so hypergamy and hypogamy, right? Those are the 2 terminologies there. Hypergamy is basically, for lack of a better colloquial term, it's marrying up, right? Versus hypogamy is marrying down. So when it comes to educated women, again, so such a sad point. that if a woman that's highly educated wants to marry a similarly educated man or one that's higher educated than her, um, this is in a remarriage, right? Where she's gotten divorced, now she's out back on the market, and she wants to marry up, right? She wants to trade up from her last one. It's very difficult for women that are highly educated because most of the highly educated men that are either higher educated than they are or just at least the equivalent education are already married by 35, which is like the median age for divorce. So typically, hypergamy only happens for younger women. Yeah, sad. Right? So, meaning that the guy gets divorced, he doesn't marry like a more educated, more thoughtful woman. He tends to marry a younger, less educated woman. So, it's more about for most women that are very highly educated, they're going to experience hypogamy, so marrying down, or not remarrying at all, most likely. So that's a depressing place to leave that. So keep getting an education, women. All right. And then what does it mean that there's a his divorce and a her divorce? So this is discussed quite a bit in the chapter, I think it's chapter 10. I mean, it's even in some of this other stuff in the study guide as well. So it's just really the difference between what kind of factors people experience. Oh no, I think it's actually chapter 12, sorry. What factors people experience based on gender, like in a heterosexual coupling, right? So for his divorce versus a her divorce, meaning there's a gender difference between, what does it mean that there is one? It just means that there's a difference in gender between what people experience in divorce. How are his and her divorces different? Specifically there, I want you to outline the factors related to them, meaning for men, being divorced is actually, again, an increase in freedom. Oftentimes he goes up in his living standards, right? Meaning you have more financial resources. And of course, it's also plagued by personal isolation, right? Which is for women, they just have decreased living standards and personal isolation, right? They might end up with the kids, in which case it's more difficult for them to date, right? So I want you to give some specifics about that in the question, or I mean, in the response to the question, so that I know that you kind of have fleshed out the difference between that. Like, how does that affect who gets remarried? Meaning, men tend to get remarried more than women, largely because of some of these factors, right? So I want you to kind of outline the factors and then talk about what that relationship is to remarriage or divorce or any of that fun stuff. Alrighty, so that's pretty much that, and you're good to go.